Good morning, everybody. My students don't always do that. Popular views of the American Civil War are rife with myths, and one of the most energetically propagated and widely accepted of those myths concerns the so-called black Confederate soldiers. According to this myth, anywhere from 10,000 to 100,000 Southern blacks, both free and slave, served voluntarily and loyally as full-fledged combat soldiers in the South's armies. Whole units, we're sometimes told, of black Confederate troops confronted Union armies from the very start of the war. None of these claims is small. 10 to 20,000 soldiers would add up to 10 to 20 full-strength infantry regiments. 50,000 soldiers would be enough to fill out 4 full-strength infantry divisions. Numbers much greater than 50,000 troops would approximate the size of Robert E. Lee's entire Army of Northern Virginia on the eve of Antietam. Those who most aggressively assert these claims generally do that in order to buttress another, even bigger one, namely that, to quote one of these writers, most blacks supported the Confederacy. Now, the Confederate war effort did depend upon the labor of its black population in many forms. Southern states and armies impressed, which is to say forced, many thousands of enslaved men and women, as well as free blacks, to build and maintain fortifications, emplace artillery, drive wagons, play music, tend horses, cook meals, wash clothes, dig graves, and so on. And some slaves served as personal servants to white soldiers. It was not unusual for such slaves to be given uniforms, and occasionally one of them even picked up and fired his master's musket at Northern soldiers, thereby perhaps winning for themselves some additional approval and trust from the white Confederate soldiers all around them. In a few places, free blacks in the South sought to prove their loyalty to the South by enrolling in local home guard and militia units that were not part of the regular Confederate forces. A handful of light-skinned men managed to slip unnoticed into regular infantry units by concealing their African ancestry and passing for white. All of these things are well-known facts. They are not controversial. Nobody that I know of denies them. What is not a fact, and what the vast majority of trained Civil War historians know is false, is the claim that large numbers of black Southerners served in the Confederate Army as soldiers. In fact, in 1861, neither the Union nor the Confederate governments would allow non-whites to serve as soldiers. And Lincoln, as we know, as Ira reminds us, changed course. But the Confederacy stood firm by its ban on black troops during the first 46 of the war's total 48 months, until the spring of 1865, that is to say, until just a few weeks before the Confederacy's final defeat and destruction. Until that point of extremity, the South wanted no slaves, indeed wanted no men at all who were not certifiably white under arms. Its leaders said so repeatedly. Right after the Battle of Bull Run, Manassas, one Confederate general, did advise Jefferson Davis to emancipate and arm slaves, and Davis vehemently rejected that advice. It would, Davis snapped, revolt and disgust the whole South. And 2 years later, when asked whether a group of well-to-do men of mixed blood in Alabama might form a Confederate regiment, Secretary of War James Seddon replied that only those who were obviously white would be allowed to don the gray. Those who could not be clearly, in Seddon's words, disconnected from Negroes could not. They could only be used as non-soldier military laborers. And Seddon in fact, affirmed that policy in November of 1864. So why was the Confederate leadership so stubborn on this score? Because it was fighting to preserve the slavery of millions of African Americans. Excuse me. It feared, quite logically, that placing black men under arms would undermine slavery, both in theory and practice. Central to the justification for slavery, after all, was the assertion that black people were inferior, and being inferior would make poor soldier material. As Secretary of War Seddon again put it, taking that stance, which the Confederacy had taken both before the North and before the world, did not allow the employment as armed soldiers of Negroes. And Confederates refused to employ blacks, and especially slaves, as soldiers for other and more practical reasons. They feared, for one thing, what black troops would do. Secretary of State Judah P. Benjamin, for example, worried that black Confederates would desert en masse to the enemy. And there was very good reason to think he was right, because that's precisely what happened. I see you're ahead of me. When Confederates ordered slaves to perform non-combat labor in support of their armies. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston summarized the result toward the close of the war in a private letter to a close friend. He said, "We have never been able to keep the impressed Negroes with an army near the enemy because they desert. If unarmed laborers deserted to the enemy, what might armed black soldiers do with their weapons if given the chance?" The Confederate leadership's policy of excluding blacks from its armed forces was effective. John Beauchamp Jones, who was a high-level assistant to the Secretary of War, kept a very complete diary, and in it he scoffed at rumors going around in the North that the Confederacy had slaves in its armies. He wrote, "This is utterly untrue. We have no armed slaves to fight for us." Later on, asked to double-check, our friend the Secretary of War, Seddon, confirmed no slaves have been employed by the Confederate government except as cooks or nurses in hospitals and for labor. At the beginning of 1864, a number of officers in the South's second biggest army, the Army of Tennessee, recognized the Confederacy's serious shortage of soldiers and shortage of likely reinforcements. And so they urged Richmond to re-examine its policy, to change it, to in fact free and arm male slaves who would fight against the Union. Jefferson Davis again forcefully and promptly rejected that proposal. In fact, he ordered an end even to all discussion of that proposal in the Army, because the very idea of putting black men in gray uniforms was too inflammatory even to allow to be aired. But by the end of that year, Davis recognized that the Confederacy's military situation had become so severe that it was necessary to reconsider. And indeed, he endorsed that proposal at the last minute. That decision of his provoked a stormy war of words that dominated the South for the next 6 months. His critics reminded him, blacks can't make good soldiers. Or if they can make good soldiers, they'll fight against the wrong soldiers. Or they would simply desert and take their weapons with them to the enemy. Now, in response to these criticisms, Davis and supporters now had to convince their skeptics that black soldiers might be induced to fight effectively and loyally for the South after all. And I think the way they argued this point, or didn't argue this point, is interesting. Because in trying to make the case, they never pointed proudly to the record of any of the black Confederate brigades or regiments or companies or even lone individuals that today's purveyors of the black Confederates myth claim were already in the field. They couldn't point to them because they didn't exist. Finally, in March of 1865, after a great deal of arm twisting, a very watered-down version of Davis's proposal finally became Confederate law. General Richard S. Ewell assumed responsibility for implementing it. Confederate leaders, Confederate journalists now predicted that recruiters would come up with virtually a black army for the Confederacy. The actual results were somewhat short of those claims. One dwarf company or two of black hospital workers was attached to a unit of the Richmond Home Guard just a few weeks before Appomattox. The regular Confederate Army managed to raise maybe 40 to 60 men. And the way the Army treated those 40 to 60 men is interesting too. It drilled them, fed them, housed them at military prison facilities, and placed them under the command of military police officers and prison wardens, demonstrating their great trust in their newly recruited black soldiers. This strikingly unsuccessful last-ditch effort, furthermore, constituted the sole exception to the Confederacy's otherwise consistent refusal to enlist African Americans as soldiers. As General Richard Ewell's longtime aide-de-camp, Major George Campbell Brown, later noted, this small group of black soldiers mustered in the last weeks of the war in Richmond were the first and only black troops used on our side. I think it's fitting to let the former slave Frederick Douglass explain why the great mass of slaves declined to respond to Jefferson Davis's offer. They turned their backs, he wrote, on that offer because it called upon the Negro for help to fight against the freedom which he so longed to find, for the bondage he would escape, called on him to fight against Lincoln the emancipator, for Davis the enslaver. To expect any appreciable number of black men to respond enthusiastically to any such proposal, Douglass wrote, was a species of madness. Thank you.